I'm Andrea, your host for today. I'm glad to welcome Dominik, who will present hardware Trojans versus logic locking, challenges and opportunities. Dominik is a chief engineer and PhD researcher at RWTH Aachen University. Among his research interests are secure processor design, embedded systems, and machine learning. In today's webinar, Dominik will focus and discuss the possible attack vectors, challenges, and opportunities of logic locking. Before we start the webinar, I would like to do a little housekeeping before we get started. As usually, today's webinar will take 30 minutes of talk followed by a 10-minute Q&A. I would like everyone who has any questions to type it in the chat box and we will answer it in the Q&A session. We will also record the webinar and later upload it on our YouTube channel around a week from now. And without any further ado, I would just like to ask Dominik to start your presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. I'll just share my slides.
Sure.
Okay. So you should be able to see them now?
Perfect, yeah.
Oh, okay, perfect, thank you. Yeah, so welcome everyone. My name is Dominik Šišejković and I'm a research assistant at the RWTH Aachen University, supervised by Professor Rainer Leupers. And I'm very glad today to tell you a little bit about hardware Trojans versus logic locking, challenges and opportunities. Okay, so let's start. So as you might know, there is kind of a new threat on the horizon nowadays. And this threat is known as hardware Trojans. So what are actually hardware Trojans? Well, we can define them as intentional, undesirable, and malicious modifications of integrated circuits, where this modification can actually happen at different stages in the IC supply chain. And typically, they can implement a wide range of attack vectors. But what we traditionally look at is, for example, information leakage or reliability degradation in terms of performance or power increase. Or in our view, one of the worst things that a Trojan could do is a denial of service. Obviously, it is very important to place such hardware Trojans in the right context. So if you place a denial of service Trojan, for example, in the context of defense applications or the automotive sector or even medical devices, then obviously such tiny changes could actually result in very dangerous repercussions. So how can we actually solve this problem, or at least try to mitigate it? So one option is to look at Trojan detection. However, it turns out that Trojan detection is inherently a very, very difficult problem because of the way or because of this wide range of possibilities in which hardware Trojans can be actually implemented. So to this day, basically hardware Trojan detection is quite incomplete and not really secure. So the other route that we decided to take is hardware Trojan prevention, that is prevention by design. But before I dive a little bit into this topic, let's first discuss, or take a look at the integrated circuit supply chain, which is nowadays, unfortunately, fully untrusted. So how does it look like? So at the beginning, we typically have some form of specification, and based on the specification, our hardware design team will try to assemble an RTL design, so a registered transfer level design, which then naturally proceeds in the logic synthesis part and the physical design part. And finally, it ends up at the fab to be put into silicon. And afterwards, so after the assembly, it can actually end up in many different devices, from our phones and smartphones down to airplanes, nuclear power plants, and many more things. And obviously, because we have nowadays this horizontal business model, due to cost reasons, it has kind of become a normal way of operation to actually include many third parties into this process. This could be in terms of third-party IPs, which obviously could be as well infected by hardware Trojans. This could be also by EDA tools, and there is also basically just a handful of EDA tools that we all have to rely on, which in principle could also be untrustworthy. And finally, of course, external design houses and the foundry itself. except for the big Intels of the world, everyone else kind of has to rely on outsourcing the fabrication to these offsite, untrusted fabrication facilities, which at the end of the day basically means that our design can go through the hands of maybe hundreds of engineers who are spread across countries or even continents. And this has created an inherent problem in security. And in terms of hardware Trojans, what we typically look at is this specific window of vulnerability. So the window where our design is kind of given to the external partners. And in terms of our research, we typically assume that this could include an external design house, which is nowadays a very common way to operate, especially for smaller companies who don't have maybe the resources or the expertise to actually perform this part in-house. So we have to include external design houses. And of course, the fab, as already mentioned. And in this window of vulnerability is where the problems could, in principle, occur. So we have to give our design out to external partners. We have a complete loss of control of what actually happens. And in turn, hardware Trojans are becoming a reality nowadays. Okay, so now we kind of know where hardware Trojans could actually appear in this IC supply chain, but let's take a step back and think about what kind of hardware Trojans we are actually looking at. So in principle, as I mentioned, hardware Trojans could be implemented at many different design stages and many different design levels, which makes it very, very difficult to classify them. So what we decided to do is to look at the problem a bit more, through a simplistic but otherwise comprehensive view. So what we can do is, what if we give an unknown design to a third party, which could be the untrusted design house or the foundry? So what they can in principle do is they could design a design-independent Trojan, which can be implanted into the hardware without any knowledge about the hardware itself. That in principle means that there is no need for a reverse engineering effort to perform this implantation of the hardware Trojan. So for example, here we have a simple hardware Trojan, basically the schoolbook example, where we have a small trigger which listens to some input signals. And for this, when this trigger gets activated, the payload will actually perform, for example, an inversion of a selected signal. And obviously, if this Trojan is implanted without any knowledge about the design itself, then it's also hard to predict what kind of damage this Trojan could lead to. So basically, we have an unknown attack in an unknown environment. And that is something which is very difficult to protect against because it is somehow design inherent. Design independent. So it does not depend on what the design actually is and where it's going to end up. So what we look at is the other class of hardware Trojans, which we call design dependent or design specific Trojans. So these are meaningful and controllable hardware Trojans. And to perform the insertion of such type of hardware Trojans, we actually expect or assume that the external entity has to invest some form of reverse engineering effort. And that basically means that the attacker is required to understand what this chip is, what the functionality of the chip is, and how the chip is actually assembled, of what kind of components. In this specific example, we have, for example, a processor design where this specific Trojan that is shown here could be implanted, for example, to invert the opcode or something similar. But in that case, because of this existing reverse engineering effort, the attacker is actually able to implant this type of Trojan, a design-specific Trojan, which in turn can end up deploying a predictable and controllable attack, and what is also very important, in a known environment. So the maximization of this attack vector is actually provided. So in principle, what I want to take away from this slide kind of is that we have to focus on design-specific Trojans if we really want to protect them, because protect against such malicious acts, because design-independent Trojans are simply at this point very difficult to solve. Okay, so what we learned is that a key factor that plays an important role in the protection of hardware design is basically the complexity of the reverse engineering process. So we have to make sure that this complexity is high enough such that our design is concealed and survives this window of vulnerability. So how can we do that? A very popular approach to protecting the integrity of hardware is known as logic locking. Sometimes it's also referred to as logic obfuscation or logic encryption, but in principle, logic locking is the term that is kind of nowadays proliferated. So that's the main term. And how does it work? In principle, the idea is quite simple. So logic locking takes as input the original circuit. Typically, it's on a gate level representation, such as the one shown here on the slide. And what it does is it implies different functional and structural changes in the design and binds these changes to a specific key input. And this has a profound impact on the security of the design, because now the functionality, so the correct functionality of the chip, is only given if the correct key is provided. That's one thing. And the other thing is that we have also a structural change in the netlist itself. And both these aspects have basically increased the complexity of actually reverse engineering this chip and coming back to the original, which is an assumption to and a requirement to actually be able to insert design-specific hardware Trojans. So what we can provide with this technology is the ability to shift the focus of the attacker from immediately jumping into the circuit to actually being required to find the correct key first. And using this simple approach, like the one shown here, where, for example, we have an XOR and inverter gate, so in essence, an XNOR gate that can change the selected signal in the circuit if the wrong key is provided. Based on this simple idea, an enormous landscape of logic locking schemes has been proposed in the last approximately 12 years or so. But unfortunately, of course, as usual in security, also many different attacks have been proposed to compromise the security of logic locking. So let's take a look at the problem of attacks. So first, what is very important to define is what is the actual attack model that we assume. So typically we assume that the attacker has three things. So the first thing is an access to the locked netlist. And this is, of course, a given one, right? If we think about an external design house or the foundry, they will at some point get a copy of our design, be it in a GDS2 format or immediately as a gate level, but the locked netlist is given. The second assumption is also very important. So we assume that the attacker is able to distinguish between the original inputs, like these ones here, and the actual key inputs. So they are not aware, of course, of the correct key, but they are aware of this differentiation. And the third very important assumption in this attack model, which is nowadays kind of very controversial, I would say, is access to an activated IC, which we often refer to as Oracle. So this assumption basically says, okay, the attacker is able to acquire some copy, so an instance of this activated IC in physical form, to actually buy it on the semiconductor market. And using this third assumption, we can divide all attacks into two large classes. So the first class is called the class of Oracle-guided attacks, and the second one, the class of Oracle-less attacks. So what does this mean? As mentioned, in terms of Oracle-guided attacks, an attacker is able to acquire a copy of this locked chip in physical format. Such an attack scenario typically makes sense in a high-volume production where we have many generations, many production rounds of the same chip with the same key. In principle, then the attacker could acquire such a copy. And such attacks, because this activated IC is available, such attacks typically focus on the functional behavior or try to exploit functional traits of this locked circuit to retrieve some knowledge about the correct key. However, so I mentioned that this third assumption is somewhat controversial nowadays. Well, I can tell you that from my view, it's controversial because of two things. So the question is about physical attacks. So in the last couple of years, we have seen different physical attacks, which have actually shown that it is quite easy to extract the key from the physical chip itself. So there is actually no need to start and execute this large machinery of Oracle guided attacks to acquire the key if we can simply or relatively simply read it out from the activated chip itself. So that's one problem. The second problem is actually the problem of secrecy. So I mentioned that in order to be able to insert a design-specific Trojan, we assume that the attacker has to find or be able to understand the functionality and the design of the circuit. So basically, that's the part that we want to keep secret. That's our secrecy factor. But in terms of Oracle guided attacks, this secrecy is already kind of given away, because if we assume that an attacker is able to buy such a copy of a chip on the semiconductor market, well, he will not just randomly buy any chip, but he will actually know what kind of chip from which vendor he's going to buy. So this part of the secrecy that we actually want to protect is already kind of out of the bag. So that's why this Oracle guided attacks are somewhat controversial at this point. And we focus a little bit more in this talk on Oracle-less attacks. So why Oracle-less attacks? Well, Oracle-less attacks, as mentioned, are attacks which only assume that the attacker has access to a netlist. So an activated IC doesn't, well, either it doesn't exist or the attacker is not able to acquire a copy. This is obviously often the case in a low volume production. Such as, for example, for high security applications, where it's not so easy to get this copy on the semiconductor market, or if we imply different encryption schemes every time for new chips. And since Oracle-less attacks do not have access to the activated IC, typically these kind of attacks try to exploit structural traits of a locked design. So they try to learn something about the correctness of the key out of the implied structure in the netlist. Okay, so now we kind of have an idea of what kind of what type of attacks are out there. And based on these two classifications, actually there has evolved an enormous landscape of attacks, which obviously we will not go into today. But what in my view is a bit more interesting is to take a step further and think about the implication of logic locking on reverse engineering. So even though we have this large amount of attacks, especially Oracle guided attacks, which are quite efficient to some extent, it turns out often often they do not really work, especially if we have complex and sequential designs, which is at the end of the day something that we want to protect, such as, for example, processor designs. And there a very interesting problem arises, and this is the big picture problem. So let me explain what I mean. So in order to understand this problem, we have to take a look at how the reverse engineering process in principle looks like. So typically we have two steps. If we assume that we start from a physical design, which would maybe be the case in an Oracle guided attack, then we go through the typical delayering and imaging and matching phases, and we end up with the form of a netlist. So this is nothing more than a textual representation of this design. And once this netlist is acquired, which will typically be in some flattened form, so it will be very hard to understand, then the natural second step the attacker would like to do is actually to partition this netlist into its original components in order to be able to perform a form of a divide and conquer attack and actually acquire the knowledge that is required to insert this form of design-specific hardware Trojan. So this partitioning is nothing, it's not really a black box. We know how it works. It can be in terms of functional data path analysis, cluster analysis, even machine learning nowadays. And this partitioning step will then output basically the original components of this netlist, which we refer to as modules, but without the knowledge of what these modules actually are. So in the next step, after this partitioning is done, we assume that an attacker would probably do the following. So he wants to know what all these modules actually do. So a functionality identification is required. In terms of a processor design, for example, if we have different modules, we would like to know that a specific module is, for example, the ALU, another one is the decoder or a controller, and so on. And using this knowledge, we can actually assemble a meaningful hardware Trojan. So this functionality identification can be performed using the usual methods like formal methods or even fuzzy methods or even machine learning methods. And the result, if it works out, is the design functionality. So that's the actual secret that we are trying to break. Now the problem, or not the problem, but using this knowledge, so using this design functionality, the attacker could actually go back into the netlist and then implant this mentioned hardware Trojan. But the problem that I wanted to address is that most attacks that we see now, especially, for example, even these Oracle guided attacks, they start immediately here. And that's what I mean with the big picture problem. So they completely ignore this whole process of reverse engineering and already give away what the functionality is and only concentrate on getting back the key. So this kind of jumps over the whole story. So using this knowledge that we have now, how this reverse engineering process actually works, we try to resolve the issue. So what do we actually have to focus on? Well, there are two things. First, we need to be able to make these modules as indistinguishable as possible. So basically, we want to change them functionally and structurally in a way such that this identification fails. That's one step. The second step is we need to be able to mitigate the partitioning, because the partitioning actually helps the attacker a lot to perform this divide and conquer approach. And in this sense, we actually introduced a meta scheme, so a meta logic locking scheme, which is very unique in its sense. Which performs exactly that. So it provides us the ability to lock all these modules with different schemes if required, which can be done based on a specific risk analysis. That's the one thing. And the second part is that it also performs or creates additional security dependencies. So these are these red arrows between selected modules. And that basically means that the activation of a single module and its functionality is actually bound to the activation and the functionality of other modules. And with that, we can actually create a constellation of connected modules, which make it much more difficult for a designer to acquire this knowledge about the modules and continue with the attack. So if you're interested, please take a look at the papers below. Okay, so we implemented this concept in a software framework, and of course it works. We had these nice papers and everything, but we actually wanted to see whether this is compatible with the usual design flow, and we wanted to put this into practice. And that's exactly what we did, and I'm very proud of this part. So together with a company partner called Hensoldt Cyber, which is a high security company placed in Munich in Germany, we actually transferred this technology into a RISC-V chip, which is called the MIG-5. So MIG-5 stands for the Made in Germany RISC-V. And this product is actually a very important milestone in logic locking design, because it's actually the first fully logic locked processor that you can in principle buy now on the semiconductor market. Another important aspect of this product is that Hensoldt Cyber basically also took this idea of a high security product beyond just the hardware. They also implemented on top of the MIG-5 a trusted entity operating system. And this operating system is based on a formally verified SEL4 microkernel. So it's a microkernel which is formally verified to actually work as expected according to the specification. And it of course gives you some very strong security properties such as isolation. So basically this MIG-5 product is really a really nice example of a high security solution for applications such as defense or critical infrastructure, automotive, and so on. So if you're interested, I would suggest to take a look at this preliminary paper, and as well, of course, at the web page of the product itself. Okay, so far we've seen that logic locking actually plays a very important role in this reverse engineering step to protect against meaningful hardware Trojans in the IC supply chain. But nowadays, as you might know, of course, machine learning is kind of all around, and it has also found a way into the design of logic locking. But before I mention that, let's go a little bit back to the Oracle LESS attacks. So I mentioned at the beginning that Oracle LESS attacks are or seem to be a more dominant form of attacks in a realistic attack scenario. One thing or one reason is this big picture problem that I mentioned. Another one is the physical attacks that kind of overshadow the need of these Oracle guided attacks. And for example, a very interesting approach that has been published as well, I think it's called TAL. So if you're interested, you can search for it online, which actually showcases that you can simply design hardware Trojans which only focus on extracting the key after the chip is activated. So it's not targeting a denial of service, for example, but only the extraction of the key. And you can actually do this or you can do this independently of any kind of logic locking scheme. So that in turn again strengthens the role of Oracle-less attacks in this domain. Okay. So since we have Oracle-less attacks, that means there is no activated IC. So it's very hard to learn about the key from the functionality. So what Oracle-less attacks typically do is they try to deduce something about the correctness of the key based on the structure of the netlist or based on the structural changes that have been implied by the logic locking policy. And it turns out that this structural change is often actually very predictable. And that means that in turn, we can tackle it with a machine learning model, or in our case, with a deep learning model. So what we did is we devised a new attack, which we called Snapshot. So it's based on a deep learning model, which is able to automatically learn this correlation between logic locking induced structural changes and the correct key in this Oracle-less attack scenario. So there is no need for an activated IC at all. So why do we call it Snapshot? So the idea is that we devise or we deploy a very simple, actually, extraction of a subgraph of the locked netlist, which we call snapshot. So it's kind of just a part of the netlist, which is related to a specific key input. And this we transform into something we call a locality vector, which can then be fed into a machine learning model to actually learn and later on predict correct key bits. So to give you a little bit of motivation why this works, we kind of did the following. So we took many locked benchmarks. And in this case, we based the research on the XOR and XNOR based locking schemes, which are integrated in a large number of logic locking proposals, but of course there are others as well. And we used these locked benchmarks, extracted those snapshots, so these excerpts of locked netlists, and we translated them to this locality format. So it's basically just a vector format that can be nicely visualized. So in these images on the right-hand side, what we did is we stacked many of these vectors on top of each other. So each row is basically one vector. And that we did for two types. So one for zero labeled localities, so zero labeled vectors, and for one labeled vector. So the 0 and the 1 are the correct keys. And interestingly, if you take a look, so if you zoom a little bit into it, I hope you can see that as well, you will be able that there are some repeating patterns. And these repeating patterns, not just that they are repeat for each label, but they also are different for the two different labels. And this is really a very strong indication that not just a human could in principle try to compromise such locking schemes, but a machine learning model is probably going to be very efficient, because you know that pattern recognition, for example, is a very strong suit of machine learning. So we use this concept and we further developed a very comprehensive kind of framework that is able to automatically evolve suitable neural networks for this specific problem. So on the right-hand side, you see basically this framework. I will definitely not go into all the different phases, but I will just give you a brief overview. So how does it work? So basically we assumed or we deployed a genetic algorithm. A genetic algorithm is nothing more than a heuristic out of this family of evolutionary computation algorithms. And this heuristic can work with the black box fitness function. And this fitness function just gives us kind of a rule of thumb measure of how good a specific architecture is for our problem. And the problem is, in this case, predicting those labels on the training set. So what does this fitness function do? Well, we represent the problem itself with a genotype. So that's kind of just a stripped down representation of the problem itself. In this case, it's just a vector of zeros and ones, which represent how many layers should be placed, internal layers should be placed in a convolutional neural network, and of which type. So using this mapping of a genotype to a phenotype, we actually construct samples of such a neural network. We train it, and then we evaluate it with the rule of thumb, whether this is good or bad. And using this fitness evaluation through many generations of the genetic algorithm, we are actually able to successively generate better results. So this was really a nice approach to this automatic solution exploration for this particular problem on one hand, and on the other hand, which is very important actually, is that the complexity of the results that we gained, such as the number of different internal layers in this convolutional neural network, actually tells us something about the problem complexity. So in fact, if, for example, no internal layers are evolved, then this convolutional neural network just collapses back to a fully connected one. And this suggests that the best thing that the network can do is actually learn by heart. So there's nothing or no form of features that the neural network can extract from the data. And this suggests a little bit about what we can do to improve logic locking in terms of ML resilience. So we took this approach. We locked many different benchmarks with these specific schemes. And we actually received very nice results. So here on the right-hand side, you see a little bit of these results. You can ignore most of it. I would just ask you to take a look at these crossed bars. So these crossed bars are basically the results of the snapshot attack. And you can see that in most cases, around 80 or even more % of the correct key bits can be correctly predicted without any need to have an oracle at hand. And what's worse, we can just predict this value just by looking at the structure of these locked subgraphs in the netlist. But this was really a nice example of, or a nice way to actually learn what we need to do to make things work, even in this ML and deep learning era. And this brings me also to the next slide, which goes well beyond the traditional CMOS logic locking. So one problem that we have nowadays with the traditional logic locking is that the secret itself is still somewhat embedded in the circuit. So if you think about these locking and the XOR XNOR based locking that I showed at the beginning of the talk, you see that even though the structure has changed and the functionality is impacted, the original functionality is still somewhere in there. Obviously, it's not easy to extract it, but it's still there. And this is kind of a problem because that means that we still give the secret to some extent to an external design house or the fabrication itself. So we need an alternative to these rigid binary key gates. And to solve this problem, we actually started a new project at our chair, which we called Bio-Nanoelectronie. So it stands for this Bio-Nanoelectronic based logic locking for secure systems. And it actually works quite interestingly. So the idea is as follows. If we take a netlist, we can actually select different gates or groups of gates that we want to protect. And we protect them in a way that we implement them in a very specific technology. And this technology allows us that each of these black boxes, for example, can in principle implement many different gates, like for example, a NAND and a NOR gate, depending on a very specific key. And in this case, this key is actually a biological key. So we use, let me just open this. So we use a system in which we are able to use DNA sequences to actually program the right voltage threshold of these transistors, which in turn can actually lead us to adjusting the functionality of these bio key gates. Why this is very interesting is in fact because this concept of using post-CMOS technologies, in this case, for example, ISFETs or silicon nanowires, offers us the ability to combine two worlds. The first one is camouflaging, and the second one is actually logic locking. And the best thing is actually that both of which are configured only after production. So if you think about this black box here, this black box will not change physically in its structure when we give it to the foundry. But the foundry doesn't really know what functionality this black box could in principle implement, because the secret and the functionality is only configured after production. So that's really a nice example of how we can combine these two worlds and actually resolve some of the issues of the traditional sense of logic locking. So for more details, I would also refer you to this publication here, and of course also to the project website. And that also brings me to the end of the presentation. So I would just like to do a small summary. So we've seen that logic locking can actually mitigate hardware Trojans if we put it in the right context. Unfortunately, nowadays, it seems like this development of this landscape of logic locking has, kind of lost its course. So there is constantly an arms race of attacks and new schemes and attacks and so on. So we have to kind of go back to the roots and actually think about the big picture in terms of reverse engineering. We've seen that deep learning and machine learning in general will play possibly a very important role in the design of logic locking in the coming years. And finally, we have also shown that new technologies can very well be used for securing the next generation of chips with beyond traditional logic locking. And that's it. Thanks a lot for listening in. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you, Dominik, for the presentation. Let's see if there are any questions. Yes, there is one. So Harish is asking, is bio-nanoelectronics configuration possible only one time after production?
That, I guess, will depend a little bit on the functionality that we try to implement or on the technology that we will use. So at this point, the project is at a very early stage. So we were able to show that this will actually work. So we know it will work. But the change of the functionality after production, or multiple changes of the functionality after production, will probably be very difficult because we work with a given DNA sequence, and putting this on the transistor itself involves, of course, some chemicals and so on. So it becomes very difficult to actually change it afterwards. But in principle, that's a really, really interesting question that we will also try to address within the project.
Thank you, Dominik, for answering the question. Are there any more questions? Let's wait a little bit until.
Sure.
I think we don't.
Everything was super clear.
Yes. I don't think that there are any more questions. Dominik, I would like to thank you again for the presentation and for answering the question. It was a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
Yes, there are nice comments in the chat box. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So this concludes the webinar. Please don't forget to fill in the feedback form that was sent in the chat box, and that will pop up also after the meeting is over. And I would also like to invite everyone to check out our conference page, because the hardwear.io USA event will be coming up in 2 weeks from now. Besides the talks, we also have some amazing CTFs, one on focusing on radio signals and another one focusing on medical devices. For those who want to meet other people, other hardware security people, I encourage you to look at our Fix-Up networking event. And I hope to see you all also next week. On the 1st of July, we have a webinar and also a panel session right after it. And have a nice evening and see you next week. Thank you, Dominik, once again.
Thank you, Andrea, for the invitation. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.